Thank you, Cindy. I appreciate very much the kind introduction, but also all your work. We know that doing these local political jobs is a little bit like herding cats. And sometimes they're the crankiest of cats. I've done a bunch of that herding myself. I want to thank all of you for being here. My goal is to be concise and really get to questions pretty quickly. I do want to take a moment of privilege and just say that coming back to Davenport is a treat, because I grew up, my godmother was a woman named Agnes Nixon, and she was married to, her husband grew up in Davenport, so I heard about Davenport. I was raised outside Philadelphia. I heard about Davenport day in and day out, and the Priester family, Bob Priester was her husband's best friend, and he went from Davenport and went out to Colorado and worked for United Bank of Denver for many years, and he became my mentor. When I got laid off, he helped me create my business plan, which became the foundation for the Wine Coop Brewing Company. And since you're nodding your head, you remember some of the Priesters. I mean, it's an old family in Davenport, and I would be nothing without the Priesters. So I always heard these incredible stories about Davenport was the community where people, they watched each other's back, they covered each other's flank, they were, it was a community that cared about each other. And now I've been running for president for the last 5 months, 5.5 months, and it's true. It's true in Davenport, it's true in most of Iowa. And it is, I view this as one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given, is to get to go back and forth across Iowa and hear your questions. Let me give you the thumbnail sketch. I mentioned I was from Philadelphia. My mother, and she was Agnes Nixon's best friend, and Agnes, just so you know, Agnes Nixon was a soap opera writer. She created All My Children, The Guiding Light, As the World Turns. She was this amazing visionary, and she was my mom's best friend. And my mom grew up in the Depression. My mom sewed all her own clothes. She didn't buy anything. She was so frugal, she'd wash tinfoil and reuse it later. And she was very resilient. She was tough. My mother was widowed twice before she was 40. Her first husband died right at the end of World War II. He was a fighter pilot. He died the day before he was going to be discharged after victory in Europe. And then she met my dad, and she had 2 kids with her first husband, had 2 more kids. I was the youngest of the 4 kids. And then my dad got cancer when I was 5 and passed away when I just had turned 8. And I never heard my mother complain, ever, not once. My mother would tell us, you cannot control what life does to you or throws at you, but you can control how you respond, whether it makes you stronger or weaker. And I took that to heart. And I've done that when I came out to Colorado as a geologist, and the price of commodities tanked in the mid-'80s, and our company got sold. Everyone got laid off. And ultimately, there were no geologist jobs. Every geologist was getting laid off. So I lost not just my job, I lost my profession. I had a master's, I had a company car. I thought I'd be a geologist forever. But I realized it was up to me to respond. And I worked with a couple friends. We ended up opening the first brew pub in the Rocky Mountains region, a brew pub, a restaurant that brews its own beer. No one thought we had a chance. Our rent was $1 per square foot per year. That's how abandoned that part of Denver was. And we didn't work with the other restaurants. We worked together. And after a few years, we turned things around. And soon there were like 5 or 6 of us restaurant guys. We were taking ads in the Denver Post together. We were buying coffee cups and pint glasses together. And it took off. And I ended up, after 15 years, and in that period, I opened brew pubs in abandoned downtowns in cities all across the Midwest, mostly in the Midwest, but Rapid City, South Dakota, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Des Moines, Iowa. If you ever went to the Raccoon River Brewing Company, that was one of the ones we started. We helped, I didn't have an ownership, but we helped start a brew pub here called Blue Cat that was over in Rock Island. All this was just getting people together to try and improve their lives. And I took that and I ran for mayor of Denver in 2003. I was just frustrated by the fundamental nonsense of government. I wanted to take the principles of small business, of taking the facts, utilizing those facts, figuring out how to solve problems, and moving the community together, getting people to work together. And I loved it. I mean, I knew in my first day as mayor that I was going to be 10 times better at being mayor than I was ever as a restaurant owner. I mean, I was a pretty good restaurant owner, But I won that. I mean, no one thought I had a snowball's chance of winning the mayor's election. I never ran for student council or class president, and I got 65% of the vote. And people were so hungry for a different type of politics, of getting people to work together, Republicans and Democrats, you know, businesses and nonprofits. And, you know, we created a transit system. Cindy referred to this a little bit. We called it Fast Tracks. But we got all the suburban mayors, 34 mayors, 2/3 of them Republicans, to universally support a tax increase to build this transit initiative. We created major police reform in Denver, and that in my first 4 years there, independent office of the monitor. We had a civilian oversight commission. We wanted to make sure. I mean, we had a tragic shooting of a 15-year-old African American boy, and we wanted to address it. And so we brought the whole community together and transformed the way we delivered justice in our city. We also had, we're the first city west of the Mississippi to have universal pre-K. I mean, after 2.5 years, Time magazine called me one of the top 5 big city mayors in America, which was kind of a joke. It was really a reflection of how many talented people I convinced them. I was a little bit like Tom Sawyer when he tried to get, you know, Huck Finn to help him paint the fence in the back of whatever her name is. What was the name of that? Yes, exactly. Becky Thatcher's backyard. That's what I did. I attracted all these people to come work with me, and we transformed the city of Denver. And you know, we were kind of a struggling city. I think now, by any measure, Denver is one of the #1 destinations for people of all ages in the country. Go forward 8 years. I ran for governor in 2010. I had been able to bring the whole region together. I got Denver to work with the rest of the state. And when I got elected governor in 2010, which was a terrible year for Democrats, I became the first Denver mayor in 120 years to get elected governor of Colorado. That's how deep the divisions had been. And we stepped up. We said we're going to make, you know, at that time we were 40th in job creation. I said we're going to become the #1 economy in America. Everyone looked at me like I was crazy. And I said we're not going to leave behind the rural areas. Well, for the last 3 years, according to U.S. News and World Report, we are the #1 economy in America for 3 years running, and our rural economy is one of the top 3 for the last 2 years. And that transformation of making sure that we didn't leave the rural part of the state behind is one of the things I'm most proud about. We were able to get broadband. By the end of next year, we'll have broadband in every single city and town in the state of Colorado. We'll be the first state in America to do that. We're able to give small incentives for small business owners to set up offices or set up businesses in rural Colorado. Again, not a huge deal, but it gives people hope when they see their community expanding. And just as Cindy was saying, you're back up to 100,000. As you begin to grow, that's when great things happen. And that's what I want to do for the country. You know, while I was mayor, while I was governor, while I was a small business owner in lower downtown Denver, I brought people together and I got big things done that Washington wasn't able to get done. And I'm not just talking about the jobs and creating a stronger economy. We got the oil and gas industry to work with the environmental community and create the first methane regulations in America. And methane is 25 times worse than CO2, than carbon dioxide for climate. No one was addressing it. Vent it, flare it, let it go. They didn't worry about it. We addressed it. We created regulations that are now being rolled out as the national policy for the entire country of Canada. They're talking about making the national policy in Mexico. We also set up the beginnings of a framework for electric vehicles. We closed coal-fired electrical plants. And in every case, we recognized we were creating best practices for the rest of the country, but ultimately for the world. In other words, what we do in the United States is not going to address climate change if we're not able to get the whole world to join us. That's what we're going to need to do to succeed with climate change. Same thing with health care. As we address universal coverage, in Colorado we got to near universal coverage, but I think we're going to need a public option. But most importantly, we've got to address the inflationary cost that health care has been eating our economy now for 35 years. And the co-pays, the increase in premiums, and I think a public option will help address that. We also have to let our government negotiate with the drug companies and get bulk purchases. We're the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't get a bulk discount when they buy their large volumes of drugs for like Medicaid or for Medicare. We also have to have transparency in our hospitals, our clinics, so we can see as consumers how much it costs if I'm taking my kid to get a tonsillectomy in this hospital versus this hospital, which one has quality but a lower cost, because that's how you're going to control inflation, is giving people choices to get the right, the higher quality, lower cost choice. And last, we also have to figure out how we're going to get everybody to pay attention to their health. And that is, in Colorado, we offered a little bounty. If you're a state employee in Colorado and you quit smoking, and we trust you, we take your word on it, your premium for your health insurance would go down just a little bit. It didn't take a lot, right? $5 a month, $10 a month, and people would change their behavior, eat healthier, exercise more. This is the other part of our economic future. We've got to recognize we're all in this together, and we've got to take care of ourselves to make sure that the system doesn't, that we don't end up as a group, as a country, bankrupting our healthcare system. I'm running for president because I've done this stuff in Colorado. We've created a plan by which we can do it in the rest of the country. I've got a real vision of what America's role can be internationally, where we don't get into a tariff war. I mean, and I've talked to all the top economists. There has never been an example in the history of America where someone came out better from a tariff war. Not one example, right? Tariff wars are for losers. And what we needed to do is build alliances with, and not just with NATO, with Australia, New Zealand, with Indonesia, with all the countries of the world, Japan, and we've got to force China to stop cheating on their international agreements, force China not to steal intellectual property, but do that not by threats or a tariff war, do that by persuasion and show them that they will have a better future by conducting their international business according to the standards that everyone else has agreed to. And we were getting to that, and the TPP needed to be improved, but that kind of agreement whereby all the industrialized countries agree that they're going to marginalize China if it doesn't change its behavior, that's how you get results. And I think our vision of what the Colorado miracle can mean for the rest of the country, of how we can take those best practices and transform them into solutions for healthcare and climate change worldwide, I think that's the vision that is going to get people in this country to recognize we don't have to settle for someone like Donald Trump, who has basically removed common decency from so much of our government. So that's my pitch. Now people say, well, you're going to get everybody to work together. That may be working in Colorado, it's not going to work in Washington. Well, I don't agree. And when I used to tell this story when I was running for mayor and I was at 4% in the polls week after week, month after month. It was a story about a professor of public speaking at the University of Wyoming talking about the importance of using opposites. If you're going to talk about the worst of times, talk about the best of times. If you talk about the agony, talk about the ecstasy. The words gain power by being close together. She asked her class, what's the opposite of despair? Kid raises their hand and goes, joy? She goes, exactly. You want people to feel despair, use joy in the same sentence. Then she asked, what's the opposite of woe? And a kid way in the back goes, giddy up! And the bottom line is, in most of life's situations, the opposite of woe is to giddy up. When things look darkest is when we have to work the hardest. And that's the lesson my mother taught me. It's the lesson I teach to my son. It's a lesson that we all have to relearn again and again, because we're facing some pretty dark challenges right now. But I believe that if we come together and link arms and work shoulder to shoulder, we can turn the worst of time into the best of time. We've got the solutions are there. We just have the will to work together and implement them. Thank you. Oh my God. That was, my goal is 10 minutes. That was like 15 minutes. I apologize. Got a little carried away. Yes?
In light of the horrible events over this past weekend in El Paso and Dayton, what are your gun control proposals?
So the question was, what are my gun proposals in light of what happened in El Paso and Dayton? I'm the one person running who's actually done it, right? So we had that shooting in the Aurora movie theater in 2012. We took a couple months to mourn the loss. I mean, it was the most traumatic thing most of us had ever experienced. I was in that mobile command center when we saw the videotape. I was with Mayor Hogan of Aurora and the chief of police. and we saw the crime scene, the first imagery, and it was, well, it was, I will never forget it. And after we mourned for a couple months, we decided first thing we would do is increase funding for mental health. Clearly this individual was not in his right mind. But we also recognized there were some basic improvements we could do to our system. One was universal background checks. Another was limiting the magazine capacity that people use for these semi-automatic weapons. And we went out and we couldn't get the Republicans in our legislature. The NRA said, if you support universal background checks, we will remove all your funding, you'll never get reelected. And so I had literally every Republican I knew, every business person, was 100% in favor of universal background checks. How do we make sure that we don't let dangerous people get their hands on guns? And yet I couldn't get a single Republican vote in the House. And we had a 1-vote majority in the Senate, a 3-vote majority in the House. And we just decided this was so important that we were going to do it. And we muscled it through. It was, I mean, it was the biggest commotion I've ever seen. And, you know, the facts bear me out. Because the Republican legislators, what the NRA told them to say was, crooks aren't stupid. Crooks aren't going to get a background check. Why should the rest of us pay $10 and wait around for 10 minutes when we want to buy a hunting rifle? So I went back and got the facts in Colorado, 5.5 million people, for 2012, getting to, in those days, since we didn't have universal background checks, we did background checks on about 50% of the gun purchases. So we went back and looked at those 50%, who did we catch? Holy smokes! We caught, there were 38 people convicted of homicide who tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. There were 133 people convicted of sexual assault, tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. We had, you know, all in all, 3,000 violent criminals tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. And it's fair to assume, since there were half the gun purchases we weren't getting to, that probably there were 3,000 people in Colorado in 2012 who were able to buy a gun who had a felony conviction for a violent crime. Just to round off that thought, the Republicans said crooks aren't stupid. 140 people, when they came to pick up their gun, we arrested them for an outstanding warrant for a violent crime. Crooks are that stupid.